The following podcast reflects our personal opinions and interpretations of publicly available information and should not be construed as factual assertions or legal advice. While we aim to provide accurate commentary, this discussion is speculative in nature and intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. We have taken care to conduct thorough research and carefully investigate the information discussed to ensure accuracy where possible. But we acknowledge that we may not have access to all the facts. As freelance producers, our views are entirely our own and do not represent or reflect the positions of any individuals or entities mentioned in this discussion. Any references to individuals, organizations, or events are made in good faith based on publicly available sources. We expressly disclaim any intent to harm reputations or imply unlawful conduct by any party. And with that said, let's get into it.
Hey y'all, Lauren here, TV producer by day, reality junkie by night, and your guide to the galaxy of shows you love to hate, hate to love, and live to bitch about. This is Reality Bites, the podcast where we deep dive into the week's buzziest reality TV and pop culture happenings.
I'm Morgan. By night, I'm Lauren's co-host and other better half. And by day, I moonlight as an executive producer. I've been around the Bravo block enough to know, let's just say, where the bodies are buried.
We'll take you through the biggest and best water cooler moments of the week through a producer's lens you won't find anywhere else.
Buckle up, buttercups.
I've had enough of you, you beast.
Beast? How dare you?
This is Reality Bites.
The New York Times isn't just a newspaper. It's an institution, a symbol of truth, courage, and historic rigor. This is the same newsroom that defied the Nixon administration to publish the Pentagon Papers, that cracked open the Harvey Weinstein scandal and won a Pulitzer for it. But even icons, especially, have legacies to protect, and sometimes that legacy becomes a liability. Take Megan Twohey, one of the journalists behind the Times' article on the alleged smear campaign involving Blake Lively. Her name carries weight, for good reason. As we all know, she and Jodi Kantor were the forces behind the Weinstein expose that reshaped Hollywood. And as we've spoken about before, Leslie Sloan, Lively and husband Ryan Reynolds' longtime publicist and co-defendant in the Baldoni Wayfarers case, also has deep roots with Twohey from the Weinstein story, of which Sloan was allegedly a major source against her longtime colleague, Harvey. Then there's Amber Tamblyn, a name not yet prominent in this saga, but impossible to ignore. A longtime co-star and public defender of Lively, she was one of the first public voices to support her after the article's release. Her connection? Tamblyn is also close friends with Jodi Kantor, Twohey's longtime reporting partner. And Tamblyn was also one of the original leaders of the #TimesUp movement, where she and Kantor's worlds intersected again. So the question becomes, did Lively's camp choose the New York Times, and specifically Megan Twohey, for her journalistic integrity, or was it for her relational proximity? Because when a powerful publicist, a supportive celebrity friend, and a trusted journalist all sit in the same ecosystem, it raises an essential question for media ethics. As the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics puts it, journalists must, quote, avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived, end quote. And when conflicts are unavoidable, disclose them. There is no public disclosure in the Times' article of potential relational ties, no editor's note addressing the journalist's proximity to key players. That's not just an omission. It's a journalistic blind spot. Even the New York Times' own ethics handbook is clear. Staff members may not cover individuals to whom they have a close personal connection without disclosure and editorial approval. If those approvals existed, they weren't disclosed. And if they weren't obtained, then the Times violated its own rules. Because the Times didn't just run Blake Lively's side of the story. It validated it, amplified it, branded it as justice. And when that power is wielded responsibly, it can be journalism at its finest. But when it's used to elevate one version of the truth without fully interrogating the other, that's not just reporting. That's journalistic engineering. Here's the hard truth. The New York Times hasn't only been used to break narratives. It's been used to build them, to spin them, to reinforce them, to legitimize them. In politics, in corporate boardrooms, in Hollywood. And in this case, it wasn't just about what the article said. It was about how it said it and how quickly it was changed. On December 21st, 2024, the New York Times published a front-page feature with a headline that felt like a shot across the bow of Hollywood. "We can bury anyone inside a Hollywood smear machine." That headline never changed, but the sub-headline did. 2 times, and each change told a different story. The first version was, quote, "A legal complaint lays out an alleged campaign to tarnish Blake Lively." Cautious, legalistic even. It anchored the story in a formal complaint, a matter of public record. But 2 hours later, a second version. Private messages detail an alleged campaign to tarnish Blake Lively. The legal guardrails are gone. Now it's private messages, not a legal complaint, suggesting closeness to the subject, a shift in sourcing, and a different tone. Then the final version, an hour after that. Private messages detail an alleged campaign to smear Blake Lively. Tarnish is now smear, a word loaded with moral judgment, intent, and potentially malice. It suggests not just damage, but deliberate destruction. But the CRD complaint filed by Lively's legal team, it never accused Baldoni or Wayfarer of a smear campaign. The word smear appears exactly once in the entire filing, and it wasn't used by Blake Lively. It was pulled from a quote by a random social media commenter, someone accusing Lively herself of trying to smear Baldoni. And yet, somehow, that word became the defining descriptor of the story. This isn't just an editorial choice. It's a repositioning of public perception under the plausible deniability guise of digital headline SEO optimization. But there's more. The article also claimed that Lively's team obtained private messages via a subpoena. Now that's serious. Subpoenas suggest legal force, court involvement, credibility. But here's the thing. There was no subpoena. There was no pending civil case, no court-ordered discovery, no legal mechanism under California, federal, or New York law that could have issued one at the time of publication. We checked thoroughly. And yet, the Times stated the existence of a subpoena as fact, with no attribution, no source, and no visible verification. Now, according to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, reporters are bound to verify information before releasing it and to take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story. If that subpoena line is incorrect and no effort was made to verify it, that's more than a factual error. That's potential recklessness, a standard that crosses into legal liability under defamation law. And the Times' own editorial guidelines say the same thing. Quote, "We must not say anything we cannot back up with sourcing. If we don't know, we don't say." So the question becomes, was this a mistake, or was it a calculated shift? A way to give the appearance of judicial weight to a set of private communications? Because when journalists use the word subpoena, it's not a flourish, it's a legal instrument. And misusing it isn't just misleading, it's misconduct. What the New York Times article does here is subtle, but surgical, transforming the Times from a neutral messenger to an active narrator. Then it goes even further with these two quotes. Lively's filings include excerpts from thousands of pages of text messages and emails that she obtained through a subpoena. These and other documents were reviewed by the New York Times. And the documents show an additional playbook for waging a largely undetectable smear campaign in the digital era. Now let's pause on that. That's not Blake Lively's voice. That's not a quote from her attorney. That's not paraphrased from the complaint. That's the New York Times speaking directly to the reader, making a declarative claim. And that sentence might be the most legally vulnerable line in the entire article. Why? Because it directly states that the Times reviewed private communications and drew an independent journalistic conclusion that Baldoni and Wayfarer were part of a largely undetectable smear campaign. Their words. But here's the problem. Some of those messages weren't in Lively's complaint. Two quotes central to the narrative of allegations of astroturfing and intentional digital sabotage don't appear in any public filing. One of those correspondences is between Baldoni and Melissa Nathan. Justin starts with, "How can we say somehow that we are not doing any of this? It looks like we are trying to take her down," end quote. Melissa responds with, "I can fully confirm we do not have bots." And then another excerpt from her is, "Blank is doing something very specific in terms of what they do. I know Jamie and Jed connected on this." Now, the second exchange between Baldoni and a different PR exec from Nathan's The Agency Group starts with Baldoni saying, quote, "The unfollow situation is what everyone is pointing at. Seemingly that something is much bigger under the surface, as why would they all unfollow?" Followed by the tag PR executive who responds, quote, "We've flagged to Jed and his team as well." These two exchanges were introduced solely through the Times' reporting, and the Times claimed those messages were obtained via subpoena. But as we covered earlier, no such subpoena existed at the time of publication. So let's be clear about what this means. The Times didn't just step outside the complaint. They stepped outside the protective boundary of verified fact and into editorial interpretation. And that's exactly where the fair reporting privilege ends. Here's why that matters. The fair reporting privilege protects journalists when they publish fair and accurate summaries of official proceedings, like court filings or government documents. But the privilege only applies if the report stays tethered to those proceedings. When a publication goes beyond the record, makes its own judgments, inserts unauthenticated evidence, or implies facts that aren't legally substantiated, that protection evaporates. And when that happens, you're not just dealing with risky journalism. You're dealing with potential defamation liability. Because if those private messages were not obtained through a legal process, if they were misrepresented, or if they were used to draw conclusions that the legal record does not support, then the Times isn't just reporting the news, it's positioning the story for impact. And it opened itself up to serious legal exposure. As the New York Times' own standards state, accuracy is not optional. Facts must be verified. Attribution must be clear. If we don't know something, we say so. So the question remains, did the Times know it was stepping beyond the legal record? Or did it cross that line knowingly? Let's imagine this from the other side for a second. You're accused, publicly, of orchestrating a covert smear campaign against a Hollywood A-lister. Your name is about to hit front pages, inboxes, and timelines around the world. And when do you find out? 9:43 p.m. on a Friday night during the holiday travel season. An email, not a phone call, drops into your inbox. You have until noon the next day to respond. That's just over 14 hours, most of them in the dead of night, none of them during business hours. Now, according to Wayfarer's legal team, the Times worked on this piece for months, then gave the accused half a night to respond. Now, on the surface, a short response window isn't unheard of in journalism. Breaking news moves fast. Reporters don't always have the luxury of waiting days. But this wasn't breaking news. This was a long-form investigative feature, a basically front-page piece. It had been in the works for weeks, at least, maybe months. So what does it mean when the accused is given just 10 working hours to respond? Could it be a procedural oversight? Or could it be a tactic? Because by shrinking the window for response, a publication can technically claim it offered, quote, right of reply, without giving the subject any real opportunity to defend themselves. And in the eyes of the law, that kind of timing isn't just unfair. It can be evidence of malice. Now, the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in the New York Times Co. v. Sullivan established the bar for defamation of public figures. Actual malice, meaning the statement was made with knowledge of its falsity or with reckless disregard for the truth. And courts have since recognized that manipulating editorial timelines to minimize or avoid rebuttal can contribute to proving that malice. So in other words, if you're writing something damaging and you deliberately don't give the subject time to meaningfully respond, that's not just a bad look. It can be a legal liability. The Society of Professional Journalists says the same thing. Diligently seek subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism or allegations of wrongdoing. Not technically seek, not barely seek, diligently seek. Let's sit with that for just a second. Was this just a tight deadline? Or was it an editorial maneuver designed to protect the portrayal without risking contradiction? Because journalism's job isn't to control the response. It's to ensure that there was one. And in this case, it wasn't just about what was written. It was about how it was timed and who lost their voice in the process. And the story has only heated up since it's left the byline and hit the courtroom. Because the New York Times didn't just publish an article. They published a liability, and they know it. That's why within weeks of Baldoni and Wayfarer filing their suit against the Times, their legal team filed a motion to dismiss and a motion to stay discovery. The goal? Classic, calculated. We're seeing a slew of motions to dismiss that will likely never make it past that stage in the case. Try to kill the case before it ever reaches the evidence phase. But for the Times, let's break down their defense line by line. Their number one defense strategy is the fair reporting privilege, as we discussed before. Their first move, it's foundational. We were just reporting what was in the legal complaint. In other words, we didn't say it, they did. We just told the public. It's the media's golden shield, fair reporting privilege. It protects journalists who fairly and accurately summarize the official proceedings like lawsuits or government filings. But Blake Lively didn't file a traditional lawsuit. Her team submitted a California Civil Rights Department complaint alongside a precursor memo crafted like a legal document but without the binding standards of one. This allowed the Times access to that fair reporting privilege. But as we spoke about before, the Times didn't only include messages from Lively's publicly filed document. It cites 2 additional messages from the alleged subpoena without any indication of verification. And that could take them squarely outside of the coverage that the fair reporting privilege provides and into massive liability. The Times also argues that smear campaign is just a turn of phrase, not a factual claim. That's the protected opinion defense. You can't sue someone for expressing subjective judgment, especially in editorial language. But opinion protection only applies if it's clearly opinion, not if it masquerades as fact. And the article never says, quote, in our opinion, this appears to be a smear campaign. It says, private messages detail an alleged campaign to smear Blake Lively. That's a statement that invites belief, not necessarily debate. To win, Baldoni must clear the toughest bar in media law. We've talked about it before, the actual malice. He must prove that the Times either knew what they published was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And the Times' stance is simple. We quoted a public filing, we asked for comment, we moved forward. Clean, technical, detached. But then came the rebuttal. Now, Wayfarer's opposition, thank you, Brian Friedman, hit back with force. You weren't just reporting, you were framing. Wayfarer says the Times abandoned attribution when it mattered most. They didn't just say, quote, according to the complaint. They spoke directly, branding Baldoni and Heath as architects of a smear machine. In doing so, they went from messengers to narrators. And that, Wayfarer argues, nullifies fair reporting protection. Now, the private text messages that weren't public record. Wayfarer points out that several damning text exchanges weren't part of the complaint, as we discussed. And they weren't backed by a subpoena either. Fair report ends when public record ends. Anything outside that has to be independently verified or it's legally vulnerable. If the Times presented unauthenticated materials as if they were from court-ordered discovery, they may have misled the public and the court. Quote, this was malicious, end quote. This is the sharpest blade in the brief. Wayfarer argues that the Times knew the context was incomplete, chose to include inflammatory language, and gave the accused less than 14 hours to respond over a holiday weekend. That's not just a bad editorial call. That's potentially actual malice. And if the court agrees, forget dismissing the case or delaying discovery. The New York Times could be exposed to serious damages and set a precedent that the media power doesn't excuse distortion, even when dressed in the language of someone else's litigation playbook. So, what happens when America's most powerful newsroom stops acting like a paper of record and starts behaving like a PR vehicle with legal armor? What happens when journalistic privilege becomes a shield for narrative warfare? Simple. The truth stops being a goal and starts becoming a tactic. The New York Times isn't just a newspaper. It's a gatekeeper, a canon maker, a builder of institutional memory. When the Times declares something newsworthy, it becomes public record. When the Times characterizes someone as a villain, that framing often becomes irrevocable, baked into public perception. And the irony, well, let's review again. The phrase smear campaign, it never appeared in the legal complaint filed by Lively's team. The private texts used to support that narrative, they weren't included in the official record either. And the claim that those messages were obtained via subpoena, unsupported and possibly false. Now let's be clear. That's not protected reporting. That's a false foundation. Because journalism isn't just about what you say. It's about how you characterize what you say. And framing matters, especially when it comes from the most powerful newsroom in the country. According to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, journalists must distinguish between advocacy and news reporting and clearly label commentary and analysis. But the Times blurred that line. They didn't just quote legal filings. They took off-the-record materials, layered them into a narrative, and treated them with the same credibility as official court documents. And what's worse, those texts may have been improperly obtained. There's no public legal process, no subpoena, no discovery order on record to justify their inclusion. Yet the Times claimed one existed. That's not just a sourcing error. That is a violation of journalistic due diligence and a possible misrepresentation to the public. It also dismantles the legal protections that they rely on. Because when a publication presents unverifiable materials as fact, frames them with loaded language, and fails to accurately disclose how or why they were obtained, They're not reporting history. They're writing it without the checks and balances of legal accountability. And that's the risk here. When media giants like the Times paint a story, it doesn't just echo online. It shapes future courtrooms. It informs jury pools. It affects reputations, careers, and cultural memory. As historian Arthur Schlesinger once said, the historian is not simply a chronicler of facts, but an interpreter of events. And in our time, that historian is often a journalist. And in this case, the Times wasn't interpreting. They were shaping the collective consciousness. And when the first draft of history is based on unverified sourcing, misleading positioning, and legally questionable claims, it's not journalism, at least not ethically. Let's stop pretending this was ever just about one article, though, or one headline, or even one lawsuit. Because it wasn't. It isn't. This is a test, a probe. How far can a legacy media institution go before it stops being journalism and starts becoming a strategic tool? The New York Times wants you to believe that they're neutral, observers, fact finders, that their role is to inform, not influence. But the moves they made in this story, those moves weren't of passive observers. They were the moves of active participants. Now let's lay them out one last time. They framed the story with legally loaded language like smear campaign that appeared nowhere in the original filing. They changed that language after publication, dialing up the heat, not dialing it back. They claimed the materials were obtained via subpoena when no such subpoena exists. They gave the accused less than half a night to respond, then published before the clock ran out. They leaned on their institutional prestige and legal privilege, not to clarify the truth, but to protect their narrative. That's not reporting. That's a media play. They didn't just publish a story. They orchestrated the release. They dictated the terms of public understanding, and in doing so, they helped shape the public perception of not just what happened, but of who was right. Here's the secret few in media want to admit. In the modern information war, perception really is power, and whoever writes the first draft of that perception wins. This isn't new. We've seen the warning signs before. When Rolling Stone published and later retracted a campus assault story that skipped verification. When NBC sat on and then buried their Weinstein expose, reportedly under internal pressure. When coverage of public figures prioritizes narrative alignment over evidentiary accuracy. Famous media critic Margaret Sullivan once said, "Transparency is the new objectivity." But what happens when even transparency is curated? This isn't just about the New York Times. This is about the role of legacy media in a post-truth world. A world where headlines outpace facts, where legal terms are messaged in real time to align with editorial tone, and where journalistic objectivity becomes a costume, worn to shield editorial decisions from critique. And when the most powerful media outlet in the world begins to play by PR rules, coordinating language, timing, tone, and access, the question isn't just did they follow the rules, it's who's actually writing them. So where does that leave us? A newspaper published a story. A bunch of lawsuits followed. Headlines were changed, narratives hardened, perceptions took root. But beneath the surface, something deeper was exposed. Not just a potential defamation, not just a journalistic misstep, but a strategic evolution where influence was coded as information, and the most powerful media institutions can operate as players, not just press. This wasn't just about Blake Lively, or Ryan Reynolds, or Justin Baldoni, or Wayfarer Studios, or even the New York Times. This was about what happens when journalism stops chasing the truth and starts deciding it. About what happens when editorial judgment becomes editorial power, when sourcing shortcuts becomes accepted norm, when objectivity is replaced by optics, and when the public, you and me, are expected to take it all at face value. Maybe this lawsuit will succeed. Maybe it won't. But the questions it raises, those won't go away. How do we hold institutions accountable when they control the narrative about themselves? What recourse exists when the truth is curated before it's confirmed? And in a world where perception spreads faster than process, who gets to write history? Because if the most trusted newsroom in the world can distort a record before it even reaches court, if they can reframe reputations before facts are fully vetted, then the line between journalism and strategy isn't just blurry. It's been crossed. And while the Times' fate is with Judge Lyman and the court, however this plays out, I can't help but be left wondering, who is journalism really serving now? The truth? Or the side best prepared to manage it? You might think It Ends With Us was just another Hollywood scandal. But what if it was a key?
A key that unlocked a door hiding in plain sight. And behind it, not just a headline, not just a lawsuit, but a glimpse into the rot beneath the surface. A system built not by accident, but by design, on power, privilege, and silence. What comes next was never meant to be uncovered. CTRL+ALT+ELITE, coming soon.